Tonight, we unlock a story buried beneath centuries of silence. A story so old, so unsettling, that the church didn't just ignore it. They rewrote the world to make sure we forgot. Long before the flood, before the first kingdom rose from the dust, giants walked the earth. Not legends, not metaphors. Flesh and blood titans, born of forbidden unions, carrying knowledge not meant for mankind. They were rulers, builders, monsters. And the flood was not just judgment, it was a reset. Ancient scrolls whispered their names. Secret books described their rise. But the Vatican cast them out, sealed them in vaults, and burned the rest. Because to speak of the Nephilim was to question everything. Who we are, where we came from, and what still walks among us. So before we descend into the world, the church tried to erase. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. What you're about to hear is not just history. It's the version they never wanted you to find. Something strange happens when you look far enough into the past. Instead of finding simpler people and primitive tools, you start to sense a world that feels too powerful, too organized, and too intelligent to fit the story we have been told. It is almost as if there was a chapter of human history so shocking that someone made sure it would never be remembered. A chapter before the Great Flood, where the earth was filled with beings who walked with a confidence that felt almost godlike. A chapter where people were not small and scared, but tall, wise, and capable of shaping the world around them in ways we still struggle to understand today. Most of us grow up hearing the Great Flood as a simple story. Water covers the earth. A single family survives. Life restarts. But what if that story was only a small piece of something much larger? What if the flood was not just a punishment, but a reset? A final attempt to bury a world that had grown beyond control. A world filled with giants who were nothing like the people we know today. Ancient writings from every corner of the planet describe the same strange figures. Tall beings with strength that shook the ground. Minds that understood the stars. Voices that carried commands like thunder. No matter the culture or continent, they appear again and again, almost as if they were once known everywhere. These are the memories the church never wanted people to ask about. They appear in old lines of scripture tucked between more acceptable stories. They hide in the Book of Enoch, which the early church banned for threatening their version of creation. They echo in Sumerian clay tablets, where sky beings give humans forbidden knowledge. They whisper in the ruins of forgotten cities that seem too advanced for their supposed age. When these scattered fragments are brought together, they do not form a myth. They form a warning. A warning about a time when the world was filled with giants who were born from a union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Union that created beings who were too powerful, too brilliant, and too dangerous for the future of humanity. These giants became rulers. They became kings. They built cities of stone and metal. They commanded armies. They manipulated the earth. Some legends even claim they could speak to the sky itself. But with power came corruption. And when corruption spread, the earth itself cried out. That is, when the ancient texts say a choice was made. The flood came not only to cleanse the world, but to wipe out an entire race that no longer belonged. A race the church later tried to erase from memory, because their existence would change everything we think we know about the past. This is the forbidden memory. Not just that giants once lived, but that they shaped the world before the waters came. And the greatest secret is this. The flood erased their cities, their kingdoms, and their monuments. But it did not erase the truth. It only buried it. And the deeper we dig, the more that buried truth refuses to stay silent. The strange thing about the Bible is that sometimes the most powerful truths are hidden in the smallest lines. Genesis chapter 6 is one of those places. It does not shout. It does not explain. It simply says, there were giants in the earth in those days. It is a single sentence that feels like a doorway opening into a world the church never wanted to discuss. A world that existed long before the flood and long before the stories most of us grew up hearing. This one sentence hints at a civilization that did not fit the simple image of early humans wandering around with basic tools. Instead, it suggests a world filled with beings who were larger, stronger, and possibly far more advanced than the people who came after them. When you read those words slowly, you can feel something ancient behind them. There were giants in the earth in those days. It does not say maybe. It does not say legend has it. It states it as a fact, a clear part of history. And yet, for hundreds of years, religious teachers pushed this line aside like it meant nothing. They called it symbolic or poetic because the truth behind it would raise questions they could not answer. If giants truly lived on Earth, then who built their cities? Where are their ruins? Why were they erased? And why did the world need a flood to get rid of them? Genesis chapter 6 goes further than most people realize. It connects the appearance of giants to mysterious beings called the sons of God, who came down and took human women as wives. That is where the giants came from. They were not just tall humans, they were hybrids. A mixture of something from the sky and something from the earth. This idea is so explosive that early church leaders banned books that explained it in more detail. They removed the Book of Enoch from Scripture because it exposed too much about who these beings were and what their arrival meant for the future of mankind. The giants described in Genesis were not simple brutes. Other ancient texts say they were rulers and warriors. They were feared across continents. They had abilities and knowledge far beyond what humans should have known at the time. They shaped early civilizations. They built structures that still confuse modern engineers. They controlled entire regions with strength that normal humans could not match. But something went wrong. The text says that the wickedness of man became great, and that the earth was filled with violence. This violence was not only caused by humans, it was caused by the giants themselves. Their power grew out of control. Their hunger for dominance poisoned the world, and that is when the decision was made. The world would be reset. The flood would come. The giants would be wiped out. Yet the memory of them was not fully erased. It survived in whispers, in scattered myths, in ancient ruins, and in that quiet but explosive line in Genesis. There were giants in the earth in those days. It is more than a sentence. It is a clue, a small crack in the wall of forgotten history, a reminder that the world before the flood was not empty and simple. It was filled with beings who changed everything, and their story is only beginning to be uncovered. There is a sentence in the Bible that many priests read quickly, hoping you do not stop to ask what it really means. It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took them as wives. That sounds simple. But behind those words is a story so strange, so controversial, that the early church decided it was safer to ignore it. Because if those sons of God were not human, then everything we thought we knew about ancient history changes. The idea that divine beings once walked the earth is not new. You see it in the stories of ancient Greece, where gods fell in love with humans and created legendary children. You see it in Egypt, in Sumer, in India. Cultures separated by oceans all talk about powerful beings who came from the sky and mixed with humans. So when Genesis says sons of God, it is not just using poetic language. It is pointing to something real. These sons of God were called the Watchers in the Book of Enoch. They were not angels with wings and harps. They were something else, powerful, intelligent, and deeply curious about the world of humans. They came down to earth, not to destroy, but to live among people. And when they saw human women, they did not stay distant. They crossed a line that had never been crossed before. They took wives, they had children. And those children were not normal. They were the Nephilim, giants born from two different worlds. This union between heaven and earth produced beings that were never meant to exist. They were stronger, faster, and smarter than any human, but they were also unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. The church feared this story because it made the boundary between the divine and the human too thin. If divine beings could fall in love, if they could break rules, then they were not perfect. If they could create life, then humans were not the only ones shaping the future of Earth. That kind of idea couldn't be allowed to spread. So the early church erased the full version of this story. They banned the Book of Enoch. They labeled it heresy. They told people it was just myth. But the truth never fully vanished. It stayed hidden in ancient scrolls, in forbidden libraries, in the quiet corners of scripture that still mention these beings, without explaining who they really were. What makes this story dangerous is not just what it says about the past. It is what it suggests about the present. If something like this happened once, could it happen again? If the line between heaven and earth was crossed before, what stopped it from being crossed now? The sons of God and the daughters of men is not just a story. It is a key that unlocks a hidden chapter of human history, one where the heavens did not stay above, one where the watchers stepped down, and one where the children they left behind became giants that still haunt our forgotten past. Long before the flood, long before history was written down in scrolls and stone, a group of mysterious beings came down to earth. They were not humans. They were not angels, in the way most people imagine. They were called the Watchers. Their story is almost completely erased from the Bible, but it survives in a book that was banned for centuries, the Book of Enoch. And what that book reveals changes everything about what we think happened before the ancient world was washed away. The Watchers were sent to observe. That was their purpose. To watch humanity grow and report what they saw. But something happened when they came close. They did not just watch, they became fascinated. They saw the beauty of Earth, the fire of human curiosity, the freedom of love and desire. And one by one, they broke their original command. They decided to stay. The Book of Enoch says they descended on Mount Hermon, a high place still considered sacred by many. There they made a pact. 200 of them agreed to take human wives and live among mankind, but they brought more than just themselves. They brought knowledge. They taught things that were never meant to be known so early. Secrets of the stars, the paths of the moon, the writing of symbols, the art of metal and weapons, the power of roots and potions. They gave humans the blueprints for tools that could heal, build, or destroy. The world changed almost overnight. Tribes became kingdoms. Stone became steel. Fire became a weapon. But knowledge without wisdom is always dangerous. The Watchers were not evil. At least, not at first. Some believed they were helping. Some truly loved the humans they lived with. But their gifts unbalanced everything. People who had once lived simply now fought for power. They made weapons of war. They chased immortality. And then came the Nephilim, the giant children born from the union of Watcher and woman. These giants were powerful beyond reason and hungry for control. The leaders of heaven could not ignore it anymore. The Watchers had not only disobeyed, they had changed the destiny of the earth. According to the Book of Enoch, a judgment was declared. The Watchers would be bound beneath the earth, chained in darkness until the end of time. Their names would be forgotten, their children would be destroyed in the flood, and their knowledge would be scattered and hidden. But something about this story refuses to stay buried. Why did so many cultures record almost the same tale? Why do ancient ruins show signs of technology that should not exist? Why do fragments of these teachings appear in secret societies, forbidden books, and symbols carved into forgotten temples? The truth is simple. The Watchers came down. They gave us a glimpse of something greater, and for that they were erased. But not completely, because deep within our myths, our ruins, and even our own curiosity, their memory still watches us, waiting to be remembered. When the Watchers came down, they did more than just live among humans. They brought with them knowledge that no one had ever seen before. Not just stories or beliefs, but real, usable knowledge, technology, systems, tools, skills that would take most civilizations thousands of years to figure out on their own. And they taught it all at once, like flipping on a light that had never existed before. It was more than a gift. It was a spark that would forever change the world. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers revealed the secrets of heaven. They showed humans how to work with metal, how to make tools from iron and weapons from bronze. Before that, people had only basic tools. But suddenly, tribes had blades, armor, and firepower. It is hard to imagine just how powerful that made them compared to their neighbors. A single sword could shift the balance of an entire region. A single smelter could turn a village into a kingdom. But that was only the beginning. The Watchers also taught astronomy, not just looking at stars, but tracking them, predicting eclipses, marking the movement of planets, building calendars so accurate they made time itself into something that could be controlled. Ancient monuments aligned perfectly with solar and lunar cycles. How did early people know exactly where the sun would rise on the longest day of the year? How did they carve temples that captured moonlight once every 19 years? The truth is, they were taught. And what they were taught came from somewhere above. They learned how to shape stone with techniques modern scientists still cannot fully explain. Some ruins contain stones weighing more than 100 tons, carved so perfectly that not even a razor blade can slide between them. And these were not the creations of random chaos. They were laid out with mathematics, geometry, angles and alignments that suggest someone understood the rules of the earth in ways we are only now rediscovering. The Book of Enoch also says one Watcher taught about the root cuttings. That might sound small, but it means medicine, chemistry, the ability to heal or poison, to numb pain or cause visions. This was not just farming knowledge. This was the beginning of science. The kind that makes people question everything. The kind that could be used for good or turned into something else entirely. The early church saw all of this. and felt fear. Because if humans once had these secrets, then the official timeline of history is wrong. If humans once stood beside beings from the sky and learned from them, then the church is no longer the only bridge between man and heaven. So they erased it. They called it myth. They banned the books that told the truth. But the ruins remain, the legends remain, and deep in the DNA of civilization itself, the fingerprints of the Watchers still exist. Not as gods, not as devils, but as teachers who gave forbidden knowledge to a world not ready to hold it. And we are still feeling the effects today. When the Watchers broke their vow and took human wives, something was born that had never existed before: the Nephilim. They were not fully human and they were not fully divine. They were something else. Giants in both size and presence, towering over men, feared by tribes, worshipped by some and hunted by others. Their very existence was a violation of the natural order, and yet, for a time, they ruled, not from the shadows, but from thrones built on stone and fear. The Bible gives us only a glimpse, a single line that says, "There were giants in the earth in those days." But other ancient texts fill in the missing pieces. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim as massive beings who devoured everything around them. They could not be satisfied with normal food. They consumed the resources of entire lands, and when that was not enough, they turned against animals. And when that still did not feed their hunger, they turned on mankind. But the Nephilim were not only physically terrifying, they were intelligent. Some were taught directly by the Watchers. They understood the stars. They built cities. They led armies. They created monuments that still remain standing after thousands of years. Many of the earliest myths about gods and demigods are actually stories of the Nephilim, remembered in broken pieces by cultures that came long after. Across the world, legends speak of powerful kings who lived for centuries, giants who fought wars that shook the sky, rulers whose voices could command storms. From Sumer to Egypt to the distant lands of the Americas, stories of enormous beings with strange knowledge echo again and again. These were not fairy tales. They were memories. Memories of a time when the Nephilim walked the earth and shaped it in their own image. But their reign was not peaceful. As their numbers grew, so did their pride. They saw themselves as gods. They demanded worship. They built temples not to the Creator, but to themselves. They took what they wanted, destroyed what they could not control. The earth became filled with violence. The skies darkened, and people began to cry out for help. The presence of the Nephilim became too much. Their strength became a threat to everything. Their wisdom became a weapon. Even the Watchers who created them could not stop what they had unleashed. It was a world spinning out of control, with no laws, no mercy, and no hope for survival. That is when the ancient texts say the decision was made. The world would be cleansed. The flood would come. But the Nephilim were not forgotten. Some believe their bones still lie beneath the earth. Others think their bloodline survived in secret. But one thing is certain. Their birth changed history. Their rule shaped continents. And their memory still lingers, just beyond the edge of what we are allowed to believe. Something strange happens. When you start digging beneath the official timeline, you begin to find things that should not exist. Ruins that are too old, tools that are too advanced, cities buried under layers of earth and ocean that were never supposed to be there. According to what most of us are taught, civilization began around 6,000 years ago. That is when writing, farming, and cities first appeared. But what if that is not the beginning at all? What if something came before, something far older and far more advanced? All over the world, there are ancient sites that defy explanation. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe stands as a mystery carved in stone. It is made of huge pillars arranged in circles, covered in strange animal symbols. Scientists say it is over 11,000 years old. That means it was built before the wheel, before writing, and even before farming was believed to exist. Who built it? And how did they move and shape those stones without tools? In the depths of the ocean, off the coast of India, lies a sunken city near Dwarka. Sonar scans show roads, walls, and possible temples under the sea. Local legends always spoke of a city swallowed by the waves. Modern science confirmed it, but the carbon dating of artifacts recovered from the site suggests it could be older than 5,000 years. That breaks everything we have been told about history. In South America, the walls of Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo in Peru are made of stones weighing more than 100 tons. They fit together without any mortar, perfectly locked like a puzzle. Not even a sheet of paper fits between them. Local legends say giants built them in ancient times. Mainstream historians claim it was all done by trial and error. But the truth feels heavier than the stones themselves. These sites are not random. They form a pattern, a whisper of an age that came before the flood. Civilizations that flourished and then vanished, leaving behind monuments that refused to disappear. The Church never accepted these findings, because if these places really are older than what Genesis allows, it means the biblical timeline is incomplete. If civilization existed before Adam, then the official story must be rewritten. And that kind of rewriting threatens everything. So for centuries, these ruins were ignored. Ancient maps that showed landmasses now underwater were called mistakes. Legends of lost kingdoms were labelled myth. But now, science is catching up to what ancient people already knew. The flood was not just a story. It was a dividing line. Before it, there were cities, towers, machines, maybe even knowledge we still cannot understand. The world before the flood was not empty. It was alive, and it left behind clues carved into stone, buried in mud and hidden beneath the sea. The question is no longer did these civilizations exist. The question is, who erased them from history, and why? There are some books that were never meant to be read, not because they were false, but because they revealed too much. Buried deep beneath layers of dust and doctrine lie ancient texts that once held a place of honor in early religious traditions. Texts that spoke of angels who fell, giants who ruled, and secrets too dangerous for a church trying to control the story of the world. Among these texts are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Together, they offer a version of history that is bold, frightening, and completely different from what we are allowed to believe. The Book of Enoch is perhaps the most dangerous of them all. It tells the full story of the Watchers. The 200 beings who descended to Earth took human wives and gave birth to the Nephilim. It does not stop there. It names names. It lists the forbidden knowledge they taught. Astronomy, weaponry, enchantments, root magic, and more. It describes how these teachings corrupted mankind, and how the earth itself cried out under the weight of their sins. The early followers of Jesus knew this book. It was quoted by the writers of the New Testament. Even Jude, one of the last books in the Bible, directly references Enoch. Yet, just a few centuries later, the Church banned it. Not because it lacked truth, but because it contained too much detail, too much evidence, too much power to question the version of history that was being written and enforced. The Book of Jubilees is no less controversial. It retells the events of Genesis with extra information the Church would rather you never read. It claims the law was given to angels before mankind was even created. It outlines the exact dates of the flood, the fall of the Watchers, and even the divisions of the earth after the waters receded. These precise details gave too much clarity. And too much clarity is dangerous when the official story needs to remain vague. The testaments of the 12 patriarchs go even deeper. They are written as the final words of Jacob's sons, the founders of the tribes of Israel. But within these farewell speeches are warnings about the corruption of the priesthood, the return of giants, and the deception that would one day grip mankind. Some lines seem to predict the rise of false teachers and the blinding of truth by power. For a church trying to maintain control, this was not prophecy, it was threat. These texts were not destroyed, they were hidden, locked away in monasteries, copied by hand in secret, buried in caves until they were found again in places like Qumran. The Vatican has never officially denied their existence, but they also never gave them back to the people. What these books reveal is simple. There was a time before the flood when giants ruled, knowledge was shared, and the heavens touched the earth. The Church decided that world was too dangerous to remember, so they replaced it with silence. But silence cannot erase the truth. It only delays its return. They were not myths to the people who lived beneath their shadows. They were kings, rulers who walked the earth like mountains wrapped in armor. They spoke with thunder, held weapons no man could lift, and claimed the blood of gods in their veins. Across the ancient world, these beings were known by many names. But behind every title, every legend, and every epic poem was the same truth. The age of the giants was real, and it was ruled by kings. One of the most famous of these rulers was Og of Bashan. The Bible mentions him only briefly, but what it says is unforgettable. He was the last of the Rephaim, a race of giants. His bed, according to scripture, was made of iron, and measured over 13 feet in length. That is not the detail you add for drama. That is the kind of fact you include when you are dealing with someone who actually existed. Og ruled over 60 cities in a region filled with ancient ruins and mysterious stone circles that still stand today. Some believe those circles were not built by men, but for giants like Og. But the legacy of giant kings stretches far beyond the lands of Israel. In ancient Mesopotamia, the oldest written story we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He stood taller than any man, moved with superhuman strength, and ruled with wisdom and violence. He searched for immortality. He fought wild beasts. He built walls that would last for thousands of years. Scholars try to call him a myth, but tablets from over 4,000 years ago list him as an actual king of Uruk. In Egypt, giant statues were not just symbols. They may have been based on rulers who actually matched their size. Some pharaohs were described as gods in human form, with lineage that connected them to the sky. In Ireland, the Book of Invasions tells of the Fomorians, a race of giant rulers who came from across the sea and took control of the island. In South America, legends speak of Viracocha's giants, who helped build the earliest cities before being destroyed by a flood. These stories are not random. They are scattered pieces of a larger puzzle, A global memory of a time when beings taller, stronger, and more powerful than men sat on thrones of stone and ruled over early civilizations. Their bloodlines became royal lines, their faces were carved into mountains, their deaths were followed by chaos. The rise of the giant kings was not just a moment in history, it was a turning point. These rulers shaped the world with their hands and their minds, but they also brought destruction. Their power became obsession, their kingdoms became empires of fear, and in the end, even their size could not protect them from the judgment that was coming. But they were never forgotten. Their names echo in scripture, in legend, in ruins that defy time. And every time we dig beneath the surface, we find another piece of their story waiting to rise again. There are places on this planet that should not exist. Walls made of stones so massive, no crane today could lift them. Platforms cut with such precision they fit tighter than modern bricks. Entire cities buried under the ocean where no tool should have reached. Mainstream archaeology calls these mysteries. But maybe they are not mysteries at all. Maybe they are monuments, left behind not by men, but by giants, architects of a forgotten world. In the highlands of Peru stands Sacsayhuaman. Its walls are made of stones, weighing more than 100 tons, some even close to 200. They are stacked like puzzle pieces. No mortar, no concrete, just perfect pressure. And these stones are not soft. They are andesite, a volcanic rock harder than granite. How did ancient builders move them through steep terrain and lift them into place? The truth is, no one knows, but the local legends do. They say the walls were built in the time of the giants, before the Inca, before the flood. Across the world in Lebanon lies Baalbek. There, at the base of the Temple of Jupiter, are the largest cut stones in human history. The trilithon stones. Each one weighs more than 800 tons. That is more than a jumbo jet. And they were moved and placed with absolute precision. No one can explain how or why. Some say the Romans built over an earlier foundation. But who built that foundation? And what kind of being had the strength and knowledge to shape stone on that scale? Beneath the oceans, we find even stranger puzzles. Off the coast of Japan lies Yonaguni, a submerged structure with sharp angles, flat surfaces, and steps that look carved by design. Some call it a natural formation, but divers have found what may be paths, walls, and even altars. If this site was once above water, it would date back more than 10,000 years. That places it before the end of the last ice age, before history, as we know it, began. Over and over again, we find these impossible ruins, cyclopean walls, lost ports, ancient roads that lead into the sea, temples aligned with the stars. The level of planning and engineering behind them is staggering. It suggests more than trial and error. It suggests minds that understood physics and balance, hands that could lift what no modern builder dares to touch. Some believe the giants were not just warriors and rulers. They were builders, architects of stone, shaping the world with vision and force. They did not sketch blueprints. They moved mountains. They carved memory into the earth itself. And when the flood came, many of their cities vanished beneath waves and mud. But not all. Some survived. Some remain. We call them ruins. But to the ones who built them, they were homes, temples, and thrones. Their fingerprints are still on every block. Their shadow still stretches across continents. And the more we dig, the louder the stone begins to speak. It tells us giants once walked here, and they left behind the blueprints of a world that time tried to erase. There was a time when the Nephilim were seen as gods. when their strength was admired and their wisdom feared. They were giants not just in size but in presence. They stood above the world like living mountains. At first they helped build, they helped lead. They taught humans how to shape stone, how to read the stars, how to speak to the earth. But that age did not last. Power always tempts, and when giants fall, they fall harder than any man. What began as guidance turned into domination. The Nephilim stopped teaching and started ruling. They raised armies, built empires, took what they wanted. Their cities became fortresses. Their temples demanded worship. They saw themselves not as caretakers, but as masters. Humans were no longer students. They became subjects, and then slaves. Ancient texts say the earth became filled with violence. The Book of Enoch paints a terrifying picture. The Nephilim began to devour everything. They consumed the crops, the animals, and even the people. Their hunger had no end. They turned on mankind not just with force, but with cruelty. Some hunted for sport. Others experimented, twisting life into unnatural forms. There are whispers in old myths about creatures that were part man, part beast. Hybrid horrors born from the dark curiosity of fallen minds. This was the true corruption of mankind, not just in blood, but in spirit. Fear replaced faith. Chaos replaced order. People no longer looked to the stars for hope. They looked to the mountains for survival. They begged for help, prayed for escape. But their cries were drowned in the sound of marching feet and the screams of the hunted. It was not just the giants who changed. Humanity itself began to fracture. Those who served the giants were given scraps of their power. They became priests of dark temples, soldiers of fallen kings. They enforced control with violence and kept the truth buried beneath ritual and fear. The old ways, the true ways, were forgotten. Every culture has a moment in its memory where things went wrong. A fall, a great forgetting, a time when the world broke and the skies grew quiet. This is that moment. The era of the Nephilim's corruption was not just the collapse of a kingdom. It was the collapse of creation's balance. The earth itself began to suffer. Natural order unraveled. Some ancient stories speak of the ground cracking, of seasons shifting, of the sun and moon losing their rhythm. It was not meant to be like this. The Watchers had stepped out of line. The Nephilim had crossed every boundary, and mankind had fallen so far that nothing short of divine judgment could restore the world. This is why the flood came, not out of anger, but out of mercy. Because if the corruption continued, there would be nothing left to save. And yet, the memory of that era still lingers, in ruins, in myth, in warnings carved in stone. A reminder that when giants rule with pride, the world begins to bleed. Before the flood came, something happened that most people never hear about. Something strange, something alive. The earth itself began to cry out, not with thunder or fire, but with a deep groan from the roots of creation. Ancient texts say the ground wept, the rivers ran thick, the sky dimmed, not because of weather, not because of war, but because the very spirit of the world could no longer carry the weight of what had happened to it. The Book of Enoch tells us that the cries of the innocent reached heaven, that the blood spilled by the Nephilim had soaked so deep into the soil that even the earth could no longer remain silent. It says the earth complained against the lawless ones. That means the planet itself was grieving, as if the mountains remembered what purity used to feel like, as if the wind could no longer bear the screams carried through its breath. The corruption was not just in people, it was in everything. The animals were changed, the land was cursed, the balance of seasons was broken, crops failed, waters turned bitter. Some stories say the stars even shifted their paths, no longer singing in harmony with the earth below. It was as if the fabric of nature itself had been torn open and something terrible had crept inside. This is not just poetic language. The ancients believed that the world was more than rock and dirt. They believed it was a living thing, something sacred, something designed to work in rhythm with heaven. When that rhythm was broken by blood and violence, the earth responded, not in rage, but in sorrow. Imagine a planet groaning, not with earthquakes or storms, but with grief. That is what these texts describe, a world mourning the innocence it had lost. The Watchers had taught forbidden knowledge. The Nephilim had ruled as monsters. Mankind had become a mirror of their cruelty. And the earth, once beautiful and whole, became a place of shadows. Some believe this is why the judgment came in water, not fire, not war, but cleansing, like washing away a sickness that had spread too far. The flood was not just punishment, it was a reset, a way to let the world breathe again, a way to stop the cries that echoed from the valleys to the stars. Even today we feel it, the connection between the earth and the spirit of man. When we destroy, the land reacts. When we forget the sacred, the balance shifts. That ancient groaning may be buried in myth, but it is not gone. It is still there, whispering through the forests, trembling under the oceans, waiting, watching, remembering, because the earth has a memory. And long ago it cried out to heaven for mercy, and heaven listened. When the world began to rot from the inside out, not everyone was blind. In the middle of all the violence and blood, there were a few who still listened to the voice behind the stars. Prophets, watchers of a different kind. Not fallen beings from the heavens, but men who walked with wisdom, saw through the chaos, and dared to speak what others feared. Their names were known long before the flood swallowed the world, and even after, their stories refused to vanish. Enoch was the first, a man who walked with God in a time when the earth was ruled by giants and corrupted kings. The Bible says Enoch was taken, not by death, but by something else, as if the Creator pulled him out of time to preserve his voice. But before he left, he wrote, "The Book of Enoch is not a fantasy. It is a record of visions, of warnings, of what would happen if the Nephilim continued to rule and if mankind continued to follow. He saw the flood before it happened. He warned that the Watchers would be judged. He spoke of stars that would fall and secrets that would be locked away. Then came Noah. Most people know him as the builder of the ark, the man with the animals and the rainbow. But that is only the sanitized version. In older texts, Noah is described as glowing when he was born. His father feared he was not fully human. Some ancient books say that Noah was chosen not just for being righteous, but because he carried something in his bloodline that needed to be preserved. He was told of the coming destruction by voices not heard by anyone else. He built not just with wood, but with purpose. Every plank was a rejection of the fallen world. Far from Israel, in the land of Mesopotamia, another name echoes the same story, Utnapishtim, the flood survivor in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He too was warned by the gods. He too built a great boat. And he too watched the waters rise until nothing was left. His story is not different. It is a mirror, a reminder that the flood was known across the earth, not as myth, but as memory. What ties these prophets together is not just what they saw, it is what they tried to pass down. Warnings, visions, blueprints of survival. But over time, their stories were softened, their messages edited. When the church rose to power, it decided which parts of these stories were allowed to survive. Enoch's book was cast out. Noah's story was trimmed into a children's tale. Utnapishtim was labelled a myth. But the warnings were never meant to be forgotten. They are still there. In the scrolls hidden beneath cathedrals. In the ruins buried under ash and water. In the stars that still move to the rhythm Enoch described. These prophets remembered what others refused to see. And they left behind a map, not just of what happened, but of what may come again, if we are brave enough to listen. The story of the flood is one of the most well-known in the world. Rain for 40 days, an ark, animals marching 2 by 2, a rainbow at the end. It is taught in schools and painted on nursery walls. But hidden beneath the surface is a version of that story the church would rather you not hear. A version where the flood was not a punishment for general wickedness, but a surgical reset. A divine reboot of the world to stop something much worse from spreading. According to ancient texts like the Book of Enoch, the earth had become overrun by beings that were never meant to exist. The Nephilim, born from the union of the Watchers and human women. They were giants, hybrids, strong beyond belief and hungry beyond control. At first, they ruled as kings, then as tyrants, and finally as predators. They consumed the earth's resources, then the animals, then the people. These hybrid giants were not just physical threats. They were spiritual ones. They carried knowledge that corrupted everything they touched. They built cities in defiance of the heavens. They mixed bloodlines. They altered nature. They broke the balance of creation itself. If they had been allowed to continue, there would have been no pure humans left. No future for mankind at all. That is why the flood happened. It was not just to punish evil. It was to wipe the slate clean, to remove the virus before it spread too far. Every culture has a memory of a great flood, in Sumeria, in India, in South America, and they all describe the same thing, a reset, a cleansing, the end of an age that had spiraled out of control. The book of Genesis says the earth was filled with violence, that all flesh had corrupted its way. It does not just mean people were bad. It means the blueprint of life itself had been damaged. Something unnatural had taken root, and there was only one way to stop it. So the waters came, not just as rain, but from the deep. The fountains of the great deep burst open. Mountains disappeared. Cities vanished. Whatever records the Nephilim had were buried in mud and silence. Their temples drowned, their towers crushed, and their names slowly erased from memory. Only one family was chosen to survive, not because they were perfect, but because they had not been corrupted. Noah's bloodline was clean. His mission was to carry forward what was still good, to rebuild, to plant again, to remember what came before, but never return to it. The rainbow was not just a promise of peace. It was a sign that the experiment of Earth had been given another chance, a fresh beginning. But deep in that story is a warning, because what caused the reset before could happen again. The corruption, the hybrids, the forgotten, knowledge. The flood was not the end. It was a restart button. And the question now is simple. Are we repeating the same patterns that led to the first reset? And if we are, what comes next? The flood was meant to end them, to wash the earth clean of the Nephilim and their corrupted bloodlines. But the story did not end there. Because not long after the waters receded and the world began again, traces of the giants began to appear once more. Their names were different. Their cities had changed. But the bloodline was still alive. Somehow, someway, they had survived. The Bible itself hints at this. In the Book of Numbers, when the Israelites are scouting the land of Canaan, they return in fear. They say they saw giants, descendants of Anak, men so large that the spies felt like grasshoppers beside them. These were not metaphors. These were military reports, physical descriptions of enemies too large to fight. Then there is Og of Bashan. His iron bed was over 13 feet long. He ruled a massive territory and was called the last of the Rephaim. That word is key. Rephaim were a race of giants, the same kind that had once filled the earth before the flood. And if Og was the last, that means there were many before him. Where did they come from if the flood had destroyed them all? One theory says that some of the bloodlines survived through the wives of Noah's sons. If even one of those women carried the genetic trace of the Nephilim, then the bloodline would continue quietly, hidden within ordinary families until it reappeared generations later. Another theory says that not all giants were destroyed. Some escaped, hidden in caves, frozen in ice, protected in high mountains, waiting for the waters to fall. Outside the Bible, stories of post-flood giants appear across the world. In Anatolia, old records speak of ancient kings with elongated skulls and giant bones found near burial mounds. In Sardinia, entire legends revolve around tombs of the giants, with remains that mysteriously vanished after being discovered. In parts of France and the British Isles, myths tell of builders so large they could shape entire hills with a single hand. Even early European royalty often claimed to be descended from gods or ancient kings who were not entirely human. These bloodlines were guarded, protected, passed on in secret. Was this prideful myth-making, or were these families preserving something much older? The church tried to erase these traces. Giants did not fit the narrative. They were too physical, too real, too connected to a version of history that questioned the timeline of Adam and the authority of heaven. So giant bones were called mistakes. Stories were labelled folklore. Sites were left unexcavated. But the trail remains. Not in just the stones or the texts. It lives in the unexplainable. The ruins too large. The kings too strange. The secrets whispered in the blood. If giants did survive, they would not announce themselves. They would rule from the shadows, hidden in plain sight, waiting, watching, and reminding us that not all of the old world was washed away. Some of it endured. Scattered throughout the Old Testament are strange names most people skip over. Amorites, Rephaim, Zamzummim, Anakim. At first glance, they sound like just more ancient tribes, enemies of Israel, minor footnotes in an old war story. But when you look closer, these names start to open a door back to a forgotten bloodline, back to the giants, and maybe even back to a part of the Bible the church quietly avoided. The Amorites were not just another group living in Canaan. They were feared, described as tall as cedars and strong as oaks. That is not just poetic language. The prophet Amos says those exact words. And in the book of Deuteronomy, God tells the Israelites not to fear them, even though they are a great and tall people. Why would that detail matter unless their size was real, unless it was terrifying? The Rephaim are even more mysterious. Their name shows up across different books of the Bible. Sometimes they are called the dead. Sometimes they are called giants. Their king was Og of Bashan, the one with the 13-foot iron bed His kingdom stretched across 60 cities, and his people were remembered with dread. They were not just big, they were ancient. Then come the Zamzummim, a name so strange it sounds made up. But it is right there in Deuteronomy. They lived before the Ammonites and were described as a great people, many and tall as the Anakim, which leads us to the Anakim themselves. These were the descendants of Anak, the same people the Israelite spies feared when they entered Canaan. They said, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim." That sentence is easy to miss, but it is one of the most explosive lines in all of Scripture, because it links the pre-flood giants to real people still living after the flood. So who were these tribes? Were they humans with long memories? Or were they actual survivors of the old bloodline, descendants of the Watchers and their monstrous children, people who still carried the strength and stature of a lost age, people who ruled by fear and power? These names were not just mentioned once. They appear again and again, in lists of conquests, in battle records, in the words of prophets. The Bible did not ignore them, but later religious institutions did. Because if these giants still lived after the flood, then the story becomes far more complicated. It means the reset was not complete. It means the threat still lingered. Modern archaeology has found massive fortresses in places these tribes were said to live. Huge stone walls, strange burial chambers, even weapons and tools that seem too advanced for their time. The land remembers. And so do the texts, the Amorites, the Rephaim, the Anakim. These were not fairy tales. They were warnings, reminders that the blood of giants did not vanish. It simply changed names, changed cities, and kept walking among men. Everyone knows the story. A young shepherd boy named David steps onto a battlefield carrying only a sling. Across from him stands a towering warrior clad in bronze. His name is Goliath. The duel is over in seconds. One stone, one fall, and David becomes a hero. It is taught as a story of faith, of courage. But buried inside that simple tale is a much older and much darker truth. Goliath was not just a big man. He was part of something ancient. Something the church later tried to shrink down to size. In the book of 1 Samuel, Goliath is described in exact measurements. Over 6 cubits and a span. That puts him at over 9 feet tall. His armor alone weighed more than most men. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. These are not exaggerations. They are battlefield observations. The Israelites had seen giants before, and they knew how to describe them. Goliath was from Gath, a city known for its giant population. In fact, the Bible mentions that there were other giants from Gath. One had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. That kind of physical detail is not poetic. It is genetic. It suggests a bloodline, a mutation that had been carried for generations. Later in 2 Samuel, we read about David's mighty men, warriors who fought and killed more giants. Not just Goliath, but his brothers or cousins. One of them had a spearhead that weighed 300 shekels of bronze. That is almost 8 pounds of metal on one end. Again, this is not a fantasy. These were real fights, against real beings. So if giants were still walking the earth during the Iron Age, what does that mean? It means the flood did not erase them completely. It means their bloodline survived through centuries, hidden in cities like Gath, buried in tribes like the Anakim, and perhaps even interwoven into royal families who guarded their ancestry in silence. The church later focused only on David's courage. It made the giants into symbols of fear or sin, but the ancient Israelites saw them as a real threat, a holdover from a time before the flood. Every battle against a giant was not just military, it was spiritual. It was a war to purge the last fragments of the Nephilim bloodline. Why did Goliath matter so much? Because he proved the giants had not disappeared. He stood as evidence that something older had survived, something the prophets had warned about, something the flood was supposed to end. And David, the boy with the sling. He was not just fighting a warrior. He was confronting a relic of the pre-flood world, a living piece of forbidden history. And when Goliath fell, it was more than victory. It was silence, a secret being buried again, but not erased. Because every time we speak his name, we reopen the story the church tried to close, the story of the giants who never really left. There are bones that were never supposed to be found, graves too large for ordinary men, skulls with double rows of teeth, femurs longer than a man's torso. These remains have surfaced for centuries, scattered across deserts, valleys, and mountaintops. But they all have one thing in common. They vanish. Quietly, without headlines, without explanation. Almost as if someone out there does not want the story of the giants to be proven. Almost as if the history we are taught is missing its tallest chapter. In the late 1800s, newspaper archives from the American Midwest began reporting bizarre finds. Farmers and archaeologists were digging into mounds and discovering skeletons over 9 feet tall. Some had unusually shaped skulls. Others were buried with copper weapons or stone tablets marked in strange symbols. The reports were detailed, eyewitnesses credible. But every time the bones were sent to museums or institutions, they disappeared. Many were said to have gone to the Smithsonian. But when asked, the Smithsonian denies they exist. Across the Atlantic, stories from Sardinia tell of massive tombs and skeletons found in caves. Local legends call them the tombs of giants. Photographs were even taken in the early 1900s showing excavated skulls and long bones. But once again, after officials got involved, the evidence was gone. The sites were closed or reclassified. The bones were never displayed. In the Middle East, near the ancient city of Bashan, where the Bible says King Og once ruled, explorers have spoken of deep chambers sealed with massive stone slabs. One report claimed a sarcophagus was found there big enough to fit a man twice the size of an average human. No one knows where that sarcophagus is today. No photos, no museum records, just whispers. In Ecuador, archaeologists discovered giant skeletons in the Amazon rainforest. One was said to measure over 7 feet, with proportions that suggested the rest of the body was even larger before erosion. Local tribes had long told stories of gods who lived in the forest, tall beings who taught them skills and vanished into the earth. Even in Asia, Buddhist texts describe beings of enormous stature who once walked the mountains and valleys. In China, reports of large skeletons were quietly published in old academic papers, then retracted or edited years later. So where are all these bones? Why are they not in museums? Why are they not in textbooks? Because if they were real, they would rewrite human history. They would prove that the Bible's references to giants were not symbolic. They would force institutions to admit that something extraordinary once lived among us, something that did not fit the narrative of slow evolution and isolated cultures. And that is where the church comes in. For For centuries, religious authorities controlled libraries, universities, and archaeological funding. They decided what was sacred and what was heresy. A race of giants born from fallen angels and human women did not fit their message, so they buried it, just like the bones. But truth has a way of surfacing, and for every artifact hidden, there are 10 more waiting in the earth, waiting for someone brave enough to see what others refuse to touch. In the beginning, the Watchers were not demons. They were not monsters or symbols of sin. They were described as angels, observers, beings from the heavens who came down to earth not with swords, but with knowledge. They taught, they guided, they gave humanity secrets once locked behind stars. But something changed. Over time, the Church took these beings and twisted their image until they became the very definition of evil. The question is, why? And the answer lies not in theology, but in control. The Book of Enoch gives us the full story. It tells of 200 Watchers who descended onto Mount Hermon. They broke divine law by taking human wives. But that was not their only sin. They shared forbidden wisdom. They taught humans how to read the stars, forge metal, use herbs, paint eyes, and write with ink. They opened doors that were meant to stay closed, but not for destruction, for advancement, for awakening. To the early readers of Enoch, the Watchers were tragic. They broke the rules, but did so with purpose. They wanted to lift humanity up, to accelerate understanding. But to the Church, that idea was dangerous. Because if humans could access divine knowledge without priests, without scripture, without holy intermediaries, then what use was the Church itself? So the Watchers had to be erased. Over centuries, the narrative shifted. The Watchers were no longer teachers. They became demons. The very ones cast into hell. The ones blamed for possession, nightmares, plagues, and madness. The link between the heavenly realm and the human mind was cut, and the gatekeepers of that knowledge became villains. The Greek word demon originally meant spirit, or guiding intelligence. It did not mean evil, it meant presence, inspiration. Even Socrates said he had a demon that whispered truth into his thoughts. But as Rome adopted Christianity, all demons became demons. All whispers became curses. And all ancient wisdom that did not come from the Church was rebranded as heresy. Even the name Enoch began to disappear. His book was removed from most versions of the Bible. His visions labeled apocryphal. And the stories of the Watchers were sealed in hidden libraries or burned in sacred fires. The priests did not want people asking why angels would ever care enough to teach us, because that question leads to others. What if the real danger was not the Watchers themselves, but what they revealed? What if they showed us that the divine was not far away, but just one layer above perception? What if they gave us tools to break the illusions of those who rule? By demonizing the Watchers, the Church protected its throne. It painted the bringers of light as bringers of darkness. But in doing so, it left behind a crack in the wall, a crack that still leaks ancient truths to those willing to look. Because maybe the real demons are not the ones who taught us too much, but the ones who kept us from remembering who we were before the silence. There are wars in the Bible that sound like ordinary battles, cities under siege, tribes clashing over land, kings rising and falling. But when you read more carefully, something strange starts to appear. The enemies are described as unusually tall, their weapons oversized, their cities surrounded by walls that reach the sky. These are not normal enemies. These are echoes of something older, something left behind after the flood. The secret wars of the Old Testament were not just human struggles. They were a cleanup operation, a quiet campaign to erase the last of the giants. It begins with Moses. As he leads the Israelites toward the Promised Land, he is told to avoid certain territories because they are ruled by giant tribes. The Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. These were not metaphors. They were real peoples known for their size and strength. In Deuteronomy, we are told that these tribes were as tall as the Anakim, and the Anakim were descendants of the Nephilim, which means these wars were not just political. They were about bloodlines. One of the clearest examples is the war against Og of Bashan. He ruled over a kingdom of 60 cities. His bed was made of iron, and over 13 feet long. That detail is not random. It is a measurement, a clue, a declaration. Og was not an ordinary man. He was a living remnant of the pre-flood world, and Moses was commanded to wipe him out. Later, under Joshua, the Israelites invade Canaan. But again, the land is filled with giants. The spies say the cities are fortified and very large. They say they saw Nephilim there, and that they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. This was not fear speaking. It was fact. The conquest of Canaan was not just about territory. It was about purging a threat that had existed since the days of Noah. The goal was to remove the last strongholds of the hybrid bloodlines, and the battles were brutal. Entire cities put to the sword, bloodlines cut off, names erased. But not all giants died in war. Some fled, some hid, some intermarried and buried their identity beneath layers of myth and migration. The church later taught that these wars were about faith, about obedience. But what they skipped over was that the enemies being wiped out were often described with superhuman features. 6 fingers, massive stature, iron weapons far heavier than what normal humans could carry. These were not just tribes. They were the last shadows of a forbidden lineage. If the flood was the first judgment, then these wars were the second wave. A more targeted effort to finish what the waters had started, to make sure that the world could move forward without the weight of giant kings and corrupted blood. And yet, traces of these wars remain, in ruins, in names, in bones pulled from the earth and quietly locked away. The giants may have lost the war, but their story never truly died. It waits in the margins. In the verses no one reads out loud. There is a reason the church buried the stories of the giants. It was never just about mythology or confusion. It was about control, about holding the keys to human origin and destiny. Because if giants really existed, if Nephilim ruled the earth, and if the Watchers came down and altered mankind, then everything the church claimed about humanity being the center of creation begins to collapse. The giants were proof that we were not alone, and worse, that we may have been changed. The idea that humans were created pure and perfect in a single moment is central to traditional theology. It says we were made in the image of God, that we are the only intelligent beings meant to rule this world. But what happens when you discover that something else was here with us? Something stronger, something smarter, something that did not come from Earth at all. The Watchers gave knowledge to humans. They shared secrets of the heavens, of metal, of stars, of roots and medicines. But they also created offspring, the Nephilim, beings of mixed essence. That means the human line was not untouched. It was altered, crossed with something else. And that idea was too dangerous for the church to allow. because it meant the fall of man was not just moral, it was biological. It meant we were not just sinful, we were hybrid. The flood was supposed to wipe all that away, to restore purity. But the bloodline returned, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Amorites. They carried it forward, and people remembered. They carved it into stones. They built cities that reflected those ancient beings. Megaliths, giant steps, impossible temples. And the church could not explain them. So instead, it ignored them, or worse, rewrote them. In the early centuries, books like Enoch, Jubilees, and the Testaments of the Patriarchs spoke clearly about giants, about the corruption of the flesh, about a war in the heavens that spilled onto the earth. But those books were banned, hidden, called heresy. Because they opened doors the church wanted closed. They told people that there was more to history than the official line, that angels could fall, that men could rise, that knowledge could be passed without a priest. Even today, the evidence is scattered, but real. Skulls with strange features, bones too large to belong to modern humans, legends that repeat across continents, governments and religious institutions quietly removing these clues. Not because they are false, but because they are true. If the giants were real, then Genesis is not a myth. It is a record, a warning. And humanity's history is not a straight line. It is a cycle of rise and fall, of interference and reset. And the church, standing on centuries of authority, could not afford to admit that we are not the first. Because once people know they were altered before, they might start to ask, who is doing the altering now? And that is the kind of question that shakes thrones. When Jesus said, the end would come like the days of Noah, most people think he was talking about violence or sin. But those who look deeper into ancient texts know there was something else happening in Noah's time, something not of this world, something the church rarely speaks of. Giants, hybrids, beings created from a forbidden union between divine and human. And if the prophecy is true, then it means those days are not locked in the past. They are returning. The days of Noah were more than just chaotic. They were days when the boundaries between heaven and earth were broken, when the Watchers descended, when the Nephilim were born, when knowledge that should have stayed hidden was unleashed on mankind. And according to Scripture, those exact conditions will appear again. Not maybe, not symbolically, but literally. As it was then, so it shall be. The Vatican avoids this prophecy because it changes everything. It suggests that history is not a line but a loop, that the past and the future are mirrors, and that what humanity thought it had buried beneath the flood is about to rise again. But how? How could giants return in a world of satellites and skyscrapers? The answer may already be here. Modern science is unlocking secrets of DNA, playing with the building blocks of life, mixing genes across species, creating things never meant to exist, just like the Watchers did. And all of it is happening behind closed doors in labs most people will never see. In the Book of Daniel, it is written that in the last days they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but shall not cleave one to another. Strange words, ancient language, but it sounds like something is coming back. Something not quite human, trying once again to blend in. In the Book of Enoch, it is said the spirits of the Nephilim would not find rest, that after death they would wander the earth as unclean spirits, that they would hunger for bodies, for hosts, for return. That idea may sound like myth, but it is written in texts older than the church itself. Prophecies from the Hopi to the Mayans also speak of a time when the Old Ones return. Not metaphorically, physically, that mountains will wake, that stars will fall, that giants will once again walk where men thought they ruled alone. The Church cannot speak of this openly. To do so would mean admitting they silenced Enoch, that they erased Jubilees, that they burned scrolls that might have warned us. And once that admission is made, people will stop trusting the gatekeepers. They will start reading the lost books, and they will see what has always been hiding in plain sight. The days of Noah were not just a time of judgment. They were a cycle beginning again. And if we are indeed in the final days, then the giants are not just part of our past. They are part of our future. Beneath the streets of Vatican City lies something few have ever seen. It is not a chapel. It is not a crypt. It is a vault. The Vatican's secret archives stretch for miles. Row upon row of locked shelves, dusty manuscripts, ancient maps, banned books, and sealed boxes stamped with forgotten names. Only a handful of people on Earth are allowed full access. Not even most cardinals have the clearance. What is hidden down there? And more importantly, what has the Church decided the world should never know? Among the whispered secrets of the archives are reports of giant remains, bones too large to be human, skulls with double rows of teeth, skeletons found by missionaries in the Americas, in Africa, in the Middle East. Some of these were said to have been collected, crated, shipped, and never seen again. Where did they go? If the rumors are true, many of them were sent straight to the Vatican, catalogued, boxed, locked away. In medieval records, church scribes debated the existence of the Nephilim. Some claimed they were metaphorical. Others insisted they were real. Giants born of angels and women. Documents from early synods and councils discuss whether these beings had souls, whether their blood could be purified, whether their story should be erased. There are stories of entire books from the Library of Alexandria ending up in the hands of the Church after the fires. Texts written in languages no longer spoken, pre-flood chronicles, descriptions of cities that glowed in the night, maps with coastlines no longer visible. Legends say that some of these were locked in the deepest rooms of the archives, not for safekeeping, but for suppression. In the 16th century, when conquistadors returned from the New World with stories of giant bones and strange gods, Vatican scholars were dispatched to investigate. They did not go to share the gospel, they went to recover evidence, to identify links between the ancient stories of the Bible and what was still being uncovered in caves and burial mounds. Those reports were written, translated, filed, and then disappeared. There are letters, it is said, between popes and early archaeologists, warning them not to publish certain findings, advising them to focus on spiritual matters, reminding them that some truths lead only to confusion, or worse, rebellion. Because if the public learned that the flood was real, that the Watchers walked among us, that the giants lived after the waters fell, then they might start to question everything else. The archives do not just hide documents, they hide memory. They hide the missing pieces of our origin. They protect a version of history curated by silence. Because once people start to ask about the giants, they will ask about the Watchers, about Enoch, about what really happened before the flood. And the Church knows that if those questions ever go mainstream, the entire structure of religious authority may begin to crack. In that underground labyrinth beneath Rome, there may be answers to questions we are still only beginning to ask. But, for now, the doors stay shut, and the past remains locked in shadow. Long before the pyramids, before Babylon, before the names in Genesis were carved into tablets, something else ruled the earth. Something taller, something ancient, something buried. The giants were not a side note in history, they were the center. The flood did not just wash away wickedness, it buried a world, a memory, a truth too dangerous for the future. Because if we remember who came before us, we might start to understand who we really are. The story of the Nephilim is more than a tale of giants. It is a key, a crack in the wall of official history. These beings were born of the Watchers, divine figures who descended with knowledge and power. They altered the course of mankind, not just by violence, but by information. They gave us tools, secrets, science, and also corruption. The world they helped build was not only grand, it was dangerous. That is why it had to be buried. The flood was not just an act of cleansing, it was a reset. A seal placed over a past too overwhelming to carry into the future. But even after the waters receded, the memory remained. In ruins, in bones, in myths, in texts quietly removed from the Bible. The giants survived in the shadows of Scripture, always there, never named too loudly. When the church rose to power, it had a choice. Tell the full story, or control the narrative. It chose control. And with that choice, entire books vanished. Enoch, Jubilees, the Testaments. Not because they were false, but because they were too true. They pointed toward a version of humanity that was not made weak and humble, but powerful and altered. A version of humanity that had once lived alongside gods and monsters. Civilizations like Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley did not rise from nothing. They inherited blueprints. They echoed a forgotten order. Geometry aligned to stars. Temples built with impossible stones. Languages that seemed to appear already complex. These were not accidents. They were fragments. Leftovers from the world before. The giants were kings, priests, tyrants, but also markers. Their presence in myth is not fiction. It is memory, memory wrapped in metaphor, shaped by time, but still breathing beneath the surface. Every legend of tall beings, of sky gods, of golden ages, it all traces back to the same buried root. And this is what the flood tried to bury. Not just bodies, but memory. Not just cities, but access. The link between humanity and its origin. The truth that we are more than dust and breath. That we were part of something much older, much higher, and much more complicated. But memory has a strange way of surviving. It leaks through cracks. It speaks in dreams. It hides in old stories, waiting for the right eyes. And now, as we rediscover ancient texts, examine forbidden ruins, and ask the questions the church told us to forget, the waters begin to part. What the flood tried to bury is rising again, not in wrath, but in revelation. And if we are willing to see it, everything changes. Because the giants were never just a myth, they were the first chapter of a story we are only just beginning to read.